such a thing as a funny Holocaust story?
It's a situation in which I myself fell into that involved the Holocaust. But in our first year of rabbinical school in Jerusalem, we were all to give divrei Torah, drashes, sermons on and hello viewers on the web. We're all supposed to teach Torah on a certain topic depending on the week, on the parsha. So I happened to get the one that we call the Icky parsha, Tazria Mitzora, which is the one that talks about leprosy and impurities from semen and all and bodily emissions. But guess what day happened to fall on that day that I was supposed to preach? Yom HaShoah.
Right.
So the question I had was, what does the Holocaust have to do with leprosy?
Okay.
Yes, I came up with a sermon and it worked, and Israelis were like, I need copies of that. So it worked out. But I had to figure out what leprosy and the Holocaust had in common.
Okay.
Yes. So
well, they're both destructive, degrading.
Yes. There was. I'm not going to go into it now, but maybe
Okay.
I'll pull that out next time. Next time those two dates fall together.
Are there still lepers? There must be still lepers somewhere.
Do you guys know where there's still lepers?
Calcutta?
Okay.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, outside of the Western world, or outside of the more developed world. So, anyways, in going through this, there are a couple of different tactics to take. Because we talk about in this course what you do, concretely, what Jews do. And so there's the question of what do Jews do with the Holocaust, with remembering the Shoah. And by the way, when we refer to it in Hebrew as the Shoah, or HaShoah, HaShoah refers to the catastrophe. It means catastrophe, which is different. The Holocaust is something where the entire thing is burnt up to God. Which you could argue is what happened, but there have been many things called holocausts throughout the years, never with the Holocaust. But it implies that there could be something sacred about it, or something as an offering of sacrifice, and this wasn't it. The Holocaust is just something awful in our history, and so Shoah may be a better term for it. So depending on who was coming today, I wasn't sure. I brought in this handout, in the middle of it, there is a section from Inside Judaism that gives a brief synopsis of the history of the Holocaust. So you guys may be interested in that.
What page is that?
That would be on the one that has 251 at the bottom. We all have some familiarity with it there, so I think we could do that reading on our own if that's okay with you. So my thought was in talking about how we've reacted to the Holocaust, and ultimately looking at a service, a Yom HaShoah service. But in terms of commemoration, there's not one particular standard. There are different standards, and there are elements of it that appear in the Reformed service. But I thought first that we should look at the philosophies and theologies and ways of thinking that we have tried to come to terms with, or acknowledge, or deal with, how we handle this atrocity that happened in our century. Does that make sense? So I wanted to start off with a reading by Gideon Hausner, who I believe was the prosecutor in the case against Eichmann, which if you look at the first page, that's what you'll find. And this kind of gives us an idea of where the Jews stood, perhaps. Well, before we do that, you said your father lived through
My
that.
husband.
Oh, I'm sorry, your husband.
My husband was born in Budapest in 1938.
Right. And then...
And I'll tell you a brief, interesting survival story. They lived in the city, and there was my father-in-law, 2 sisters and a brother, so there were four people and their spouses and their children. and that they survived hiding in the basement of their own apartment building, which had been turned over to not the SS but the German army as a headquarters. And the German soldiers who were using that building looked the other way. They knew that they were all in the basement. They never helped them, but they did. They left them alone. And they were in the basement of their own apartment building. And then when the war was over, and the Russians came into Budapest, my father-in-law and his one brother, and I think a brother-in-law, helped these few German soldiers get civilian clothing so that they could get away from the Russians.
That's incredible.
That's how they survived, because they were just left alone. And my husband had bright red hair, and his mother used to cover his hair with black shoe polish, because most Hungarians have olive skin and dark hair, and to keep him from being so obvious, they used to dirty up his very fair skin and color his hair black. Now he survived, and his parents that whole family, there's 18 or 20 people that survived in that basement.
Wow.
And then when they went back to their apartment after the war, they went, of course, it became communist Budapest. And his mother would raise chickens on the balcony of their apartment because they had no food.
Mm-hmm.
She'd raise chickens. Of course, those chickens that he played with wound up at the dinner
The
table.
Oh, there's Clucky.
Exactly. But that's how that particular family survived.
Wow.
Others of his family went. My one cousin who still lives in Florida, she was in Auschwitz and she's got the tattoo.
Yes.
She's about 88 years old now. George's my husband's name is George. His cousin, and others went to camps, and just like she survived very well. They came here, they raised a family, but her sister, who came here also, never, how do you say it? She never recovered.
She never got over it.
She never, I think you either recover, not that you totally recover, but you learn to
terms.
cope. You learn to cope, and other people never learn to cope.
Yes.
I think that's how it is for.
And we'll look at that not only with individuals, but on a larger Jewish perspective of how, as a people, do we cope theologically. Hey Rob, good to see you.
How are you?
It's good, you? We're talking about the Shoah, the Holocaust.
If you haven't seen it already, Rochelle Harger did her speech on it.
Yeah, I didn't know her. She was very sick and dying when I got to the temple. Hank's wife.
Hank's wife.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't know
And
her.
for a long time, the kids would ask her about her number. And that was part of how Rabbi Bravo started the whole Jewish Journey talk. Because Rochelle did hers first, so she could tell everybody. And for once, let the kids ask her questions, and she told all of that. That was why it was so cool when Hank did his, because you got both of their perspectives, and that is an unbelievable story, love story born out of so much tragedy.
Right.
Mm.
Do you have any connection?
No, none whatsoever.
So let's turn and do you have any connection to the Holocaust?
Yeah. My father's 2-year-old sister was gassed in Auschwitz. All my great-grandparents died. But pretty much all of them, not all of them, but part of them died. Some of them died in the Holocaust.
And a lot of my family as well. I guess my grandfather on my father's side left, and his brother left.
Where were they from originally?
From Ukraine, or I guess Poland. It's all the same. That area. From that area.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, and the rest of their family never made it out.
My family came over in the early part of the 20th century. It was my husband's family. My husband came in 1957, which was the Hungarian Revolution. That's when he came. But my family my parents were born here. I'm sure we all have relatives because they came from Poland or Belarus back in the early 1900s. They left behind family who were probably, those days people left you to even keep in touch because you couldn't.
You didn't know what you could do.
Yeah,
So
my grandparents came from Poland.
Yeah.
My mother was born here.
Yeah, both my parents were born here.
Brian's grandparents fled from Switzerland and the family.
So let's look for, I guess this is the first major reaction where we could really speak up and be heard on an international perspective, on an international scale. And we encountered Eichmann, and when we can make that case against him. This was in 1961, and this was published in the Jerusalem Post in 1961. That is 23 years after the creation of Israel, 24 years after the war ended in 1947, I believe, 24 years after the end of the war. It took that long until the 60s for the Jewish people really to be able to speak up. We'll talk about why after. But let's look, so let's read through this. Would anyone like to start? And please read it clearly so that way our e-viewers can...
Right from the beginning, right?
Yes.
Okay. When I stand before you here, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards him who sits in the dock and cry, I accuse. For their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka and are strewn in the forests of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore I will be their spokesman, and in their name I will unfold the awesome indictment.
It's about justice for all those.
The history of the Jewish people is steeped in suffering and tears, yet never down the entire blood-stained road traveled by this people, never since the first days of its nationhood, has any man arisen who succeeded in dealing it such grievous blows as did Hitler's iniquitous regime, and Adolf Eichmann as its executive arm for the extermination of the Jewish people. In all human history, there is no other example of a man against whom it would be possible to draw up such a bill of indictment as to be read here. Murder has been with the human race since the days when Cain killed Abel. It is no novel phenomenon, but we have had to wait until this 20th century to witness with our own eyes a new kind of murder, not the result of the momentary surge of passion or mental blackout, but of calculated decision and painstaking planning, not through the evil design of an individual, but through the mighty criminal conspiracy involving thousands, not against one victim whom an assassin may have decided to destroy, but against an entire people.
This murderous decision, taken deliberately and in cold blood, to annihilate a nation and blot it out from the face of the earth, is so shocking that one is at a loss for words to describe it. Words exist to express what man's reason can conceive and his heart contain, but here we are dealing with the actions that transcend our human grasp. Yet this is what did happen. Millions were condemned to death not for any crime, not for anything they had done, but only because they belonged to the Jewish people. The development of technology placed at the disposal of the destroyers efficient equipment for the execution of their appalling designs. This unprecedented crime, carried out by Europeans in the 20th century, led to the definition of the criminal concept unknown to human annals, even during the darkest ages, the crime of genocide. Hitler, his regime and crimes were no accidental or transient phenomenon. He did not come to power as a result merely of a unique combination of circumstances. Historical processes are usually the product of many developments, like many streams flowing each in its own channel until they combine into a mighty river. They will come together only if their flow is in the same general direction.
I just want to pause us. I know this paragraph is transitioning us to the next point. So to pause before, what's happening here?
These basically, they're establishing intent, which is necessary for a crime to be committed. I think that's one of the things they're trying to do. And also showing how it wasn't just one person, but a variety of parties, and sort of like a quilt, they're all sewn together and compound each other to form the Holocaust.
Not only that, there's something...
And the magnanimity.
The magnitude. They're
Yeah.
Well,
never
just the
The
concept that
magnitude,
you would want to destroy an entire people.
simply because.
Simply because, not because they had done you wrong,
Right.
simply because they existed and you didn't want them to exist.
And not only that you had the thought to do it, that a person would have the thought to do it, but that the person would succeed
But they could
in
pull
building
together
the machinery
exactly.
and to do it systemically.
So what
And
does
that
that
the
tell
world
you
stood
about the
by.
mindset of the participants?
We'll get to that. But
Yeah, the
so we're
world stood
establishing, because before we talk about how we deal with it as Jews, we need to review how it feels. The sense of the magnitude. Pardon me?
It's like shit.
I mean, that doesn't even describe.
No,
It's more than anybody can fathom.
it's more. You're right, because it's very hard to understand that kind of hatred. How you could hate anyone that much.
Eddie Izzard, who's a comedian,
What's his name? I'm sorry.
Eddie Izzard. He's the one. He's been in a bunch of things, but he's a very funny comedian. But he was making light of a tough situation. But he was saying at what point of the numbers do you stop being a murderer and start being so? It hits such a number that you just go down in history for something completely different. A murderer, he says, 2 people, 3 people, whoa, 10 people here, serial killer. When you hit the millions, it just we don't have.
Cannot conceive.
He's making light of it, but because of how awful it is. But you cannot. I mean, there's a phenomenon that's much more common in Israel of making a lot of Holocaust jokes, because one reaction that we have and they're not making jokes at the expense, but they're making it because one reaction you have to absolute evil or absolute horrors is to find humor in it, to laugh at it, because somehow you're taking control of the situation.
If I interject, a common barb or insult made by one Knesset member, which is a parliament, member of the Israeli parliament against another one, is calling each other Nazis. It's very it's very common in the Israeli parliament to do that.
The
and I always
word
find it
Nazi
disgusting.
is thrown around lightly, even from Seinfeld.
Yeah, but that's a joke. But
I know, but it's still the concept that the word is just used in a joke.
Did you hear today they gave a soccer player a ban of life from a soccer league because he gave a Nazi salute? He's 20 years old and said
And
he
where did he
didn't
learn
know
that?
why it was offensive.
Right. And I'm not, just to give you an example of some of this humor that I think is at the cross of offensive. One of the ones that I think is more clever is about how tall was Hitler. Was tall. There's tons of that. It works for some people.
Funny. I'm gonna have a joke.
It's funny because it's ironic that or not ironic, but just it's silly. It's making it slapstick in a sense, in that.
Oh, I see.
It's taking what's difficult. It's taking things that are taboo, that are impossible to understand, and just trying to make light of it because it helps coast over the pain.
Curious, if I may ask, does anybody really know how tall he was? I'm just curious.
5'5".
He was 5'5".
Yeah.
Well, that's where people see the Napoleon complex.
Mm-hmm.
Just
wonder
the
if he
whole
had a Napoleon
concept that
complex.
millions of people followed him.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so ironic.
Where was the humanity in all these people that they
Let's look
followed?
to that. Let's look at what. Let's look to what Gideon
Young
Hausner had to
people,
say.
where were their parents and things like that
Well,
in order to follow?
Right. To understand, I mean, lots of reasons why people followed, because they were afraid for themselves, because they didn't.
Well, that they were,
but that doesn't make it right. Does
millions
not
of
make
people
it right.
gave up their neighbors and murdered children, and you can't ever understand it.
Exactly.
Ever.
I think more important. I think what's to me not troubling, but the mere fact that to me the more important thing is that it's learning something about human nature. That it wasn't done like right away. It was done methodically, and so people had to accept certain steps. I think if they knew that German people would just accept, exterminating the Jewish people. First, they had to throw them out of the schools. and not only that, but they also combined the Holocaust with good things for the German people, so that they could say to themselves, "Oh well, it's good for me." And I heard somebody tell me, "Oh, Mussolini I like Mussolini because he did good things for Italians." A friend of mine once told me that, who was of Italian ethnicity, and so that's you have to watch out for things like that in society.
Yeah. I want to. I think that this is a lot of review for Gideon Hazar. I think it got us in the perspective, and I'd encourage you to read. But so I want to go through. Question is, so what happened? How, as a people, how do we deal with this after? And what happens? You may know that there was relative silence about this after the Holocaust until the 60s. We didn't talk about it.
Well, nobody believed it happened.
Some people didn't believe it.
Some
happened.
people still don't believe it.
But I mean, silence even among Jews.
Well, it's beyond shocking.
It's beyond shocking. It's horrible. And as a victim, there's a sense of shame as well.
Okay.
There's a sense of shame that it could have
we let
happened.
this happen.
Exactly.
But it also brings up a lot of questions that no person, no country wants to answer.
Yeah.
We all talk about how this is the greatest country in the world, which is true, but that doesn't make us perfect. And as Americans, we have to look at ourselves and look at the stain of so much blood on our own hands.
Because no country let them in.
Exactly.
There-
And we
there was a
stood with the
famous,
rest of the world watching
the
this
ship.
happen.
There's a famous Canadian quote, I can't remember who said it, but when they're talking about bringing in Jews, one Canadian immigration official said none is too many.
Well,
They let them into China, though.
Some, yes.
Well, the thing about Shanghai,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, we know Lena Feld was born in Shanghai.
Right.
She's in your Lunch and Learn
Yes.
class, I think. The Asian countries, because they are, and this was always my thought, basically atheistic, they didn't have any of this anti-anything. Just like the India doesn't have a history of anti-Semitism. Am I right? They really.
But they're not an atheist country, though.
No, they're not. But they're the countries that didn't have a strong Christian-based society were the countries that were helpful. The ones that had that "they killed Christ" mentality, those are the countries that were less helpful.
But I want to refocus us.
Okay.
Because we could go in all sorts of directions.
Yes.
Of course, I want to focus us not on how others reacted, but on how
we
Jews react, how we react as Jews. So part of the silence in American Jewry was out of guilt. That somehow, perhaps we could have done something, maybe we didn't. Part of it was guilt. Part of it was collective trauma. That when something so awful happens, you can't talk about it. You're afraid to talk
Now, does
about
it have, I hate to keep interrupting with questions, but my parents' generation of Jewish people had this mentality. They were good people, but they had a mentality that anything unpleasant was a secret.
Yes.
If
We
you
still
had
have that
cancer,
sometimes.
if you had diabetes, nothing that...
Mental illness, God
Mental
forbid.
illness, everything was a shanda and everything was a secret. So
And you don't want to cause trouble.
Exactly, and you don't want anyone to know about your dirty laundry, whether your husband has cancer or your daughter has mental illness. So could that be part of it for that generation that said, oh my God, maybe if we don't talk about this, it'll go away.
I think it's
Jews
beyond
of
that.
that generation. How do you think the Catholic Church got away with that systemic? Because nobody talked about it.
But I think maybe it was that generation of people. Now everyone talks about more than they should talk about.
I have a feeling that it was much bigger than that.
Think so?
Yeah, because everybody knew it, and it wasn't just one person. I think it was just too large, and there was too much pain, and there was too much shame as people to be able to talk about it. So what changed? We hit the 60s. We had the Eichmann trial, where it suddenly became in public.
It came public. Everything
Exactly.
came public.
Everything came public. We also, Jews were becoming more ingrained in society, more influential, where we could speak up. You had you had the Black Power movement. You had, where it was becoming okay to be ethnic. You were seeing more success in Israel, which we could take a lot of pride in. So we could speak up. And in addition, at that same time, so I'm just looking at my notes, you had the Protestant Death of God movement, which the death of God saying that to act as if there's no God.
Sorry.
The world can be a horrible place, and because of all these atrocities, which in some ways is coming to terms with what happened. So you get a lot of, so we start to have these conversations, and Jews could boldly act against anti-Semitism at this point, and feel religiously free as soon as they lost the concept. Because when we try to think of, well, what was God's hand in the Holocaust? Well, this was a punishment for Jews not doing something. Because in the old mindset, bad things happen to you because clearly you've been punished. If God is dead at this point, then you can freely attack him. From a religious perspective, you could freely attack it. So let's go through what were the different religious reactions, the different theological reactions from a Jewish perspective. One of them was this death of God idea. Another one, which I'm sure, which I hope you've heard of, is Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel, who wrote Night, and
I read that.
Most of his works are fiction. I'm sure you're all familiar with Elie Wiesel as well. For him, this was a unique event in history, a brand new event, of course, and it's so agonizing, so horrifying that we can't understand. There's no way to explain it. And it's so significant that he calls it a new revelation, a new form of Sinai for everyone, because you could not see human life in a different way. It changed the way that we saw it. It was a new atrocity that we did not know that people could commit. It was something horrific that we didn't know that could happen. And so he says we can't try to understand it, but what we have to do is witness to it. That Elie Wiesel, what he does is we try to come to terms with it through witnessing, through bringing up the story again and again and again, and making sure ultimately that we don't despair, that we're still here, that we're still alive, and that we never forget. That is Elie Wiesel's perspective. And he also is very much that we need to take personal responsibility, both those who were responsible in Germany should absolutely be responsible, but also that we need to be responsible for continuing to live. That's Elie Wiesel, that's one reaction. There's another theologian, Richard Rubinstein, who agrees with Wiesel that Auschwitz was like Sinai, that it was a brand new revelation. But he is much more radical in terms of his pushback against Judaism. That in a sense that his Judaism now has no allusions to it, and ultimately he says that because of the evil of the Nazis, we have this concept that the Jewish people are the chosen people. He said we have to abandon that. Because being chosen means as well that we suffer. When Jewish people suffer, we believe that we were suffering because we're God's servant. And as God's servant, some of it comes with extra suffering. You know, you get the Jewish guilt from God. And he says that to call ourselves the chosen people is in a sense to let the Nazis off the hook, because we deserve this extra punishment, this extra attention from God. And he said that that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. And so in order to say that the Nazis are entirely on the hook, he really had to paint how human and how like everyone else the Jews are. That we are people like everyone. And so likewise when we get our own state, when we get our own state, that it can't be a state where we just try to be the ideal, but that we simply, and Israel's already our own state, but that it's there so that we can live like everyone. Right, so
point, if I may.
Yes.
That was important. It was something before, but I wanted to make sure we said it.
Yes.
We talked about, you mentioned that only the religions where there was a heavy Christian influence were involved in perpetrating the Holocaust. It's not completely true, because there were Holocausts in Muslim countries as well. For example, in Tunisia, and there was complicity by many Muslims with Hitler, and there are also many pogroms by Muslims against Jews. So I think that needs to be stated.
Maybe I should have said in countries where religion was a primary factor in their lives.
Well, it was in the Muslim worlds too, but I just think that you're right in the sense there wasn't any mass Holocaust in the Arab countries, but there certainly was complicity and violence against Jews.
But I don't want to spend time on that because it's a different conversation. But it's an important conversation, but a different one. But so where basically where Rubinstein comes in is that ultimately, if we're not the chosen people, we're abandoning the entire classical faith of Judaism. That classical Judaism, believing that God is responsible for everything that happens, simply doesn't work anymore. It's no excuse. You can't blame the atrocity of what the Nazis did. You can't say that they were God's tools in the way that it was said that the Egyptians, who kept the Israelites a slave for 400 years, were in a sense God's tool of punishment. And he says that's unacceptable, and so rather than having the holy God, he starts calling it the holy nothingness. And he says that he talks about kind of an inverted messianism, that the ultimate Messiah, the ultimate redemption from this life is death, which is very depressing. But it's him responding to a very depressing situation. And so what he says is that Judaism that we have to continue to do, the Judaism to go post-Holocaust has to be a Judaism where it is a self-preservation and it's self-care. And so Jewish identity is about making sure that as a people we can survive, ultimately, and cut God out of the picture.
Okay.
Which there's so much anger in there that it makes sense. So that's ultimately the Jewish death of God movement. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
We clearly have come far since then.
My first cousin told me about a year ago that the reason we have he comes from a yeshivish background. His wife is Hasidic. He told me that the Holocaust was a punishment from God.
Right, and that's where a lot of these modern thinkers just couldn't deal with that, rightfully so. But that is one perspective, that the Jewish people clearly did something, so God's punishing us. Then you get another one, which I always grew up knowing this philosopher because he's Canadian. He's a survivor as well, I believe, or he left at some point. But you have somebody. Have you heard the name of Emil Fackenheim?
No.
Emil Fackenheim. He said that there was a brand new kind of suffering, a brand new kind of evil that came out of the Holocaust. And there were two factors. One was that there was no charge against Jews. It was not because of belief, as we talked about. It was entirely just because of who they were. It was a problem of biology, which was a first. And that he also commented that other evil that had never been seen before is that the Nazis knew exactly what they were doing. That it was a demonic desire for evil. And so he also saw this as a brand new revelation to come. Like Elie Wiesel, what he called it was the 614th commandment. That there were 613 commandments given at Sinai. And he said that there are four parts to it. Jews are forbidden to hand Hitler a posthumous victory, which means that we must make sure that the Jews are never annihilated from this world, because that would be giving Hitler a victory after his death. We must survive as Jews, we must remember the victims, and we must not despair of God, lest Judaism perish. And unlike the others, he's saying that we always need to remember, and I guess with Elie Wiesel, but Elie Wiesel doesn't deal with what happened in his concrete, philosophical way. Elie Wiesel tells the story. Elie Wiesel brings up the memories. He says that this is a new case of evil. This is a big change. but we still have to include God in the mix because God is essential to the Jewish people. And regardless of what you might think of what God has done, we need God as part of who we are, and therefore we must survive and we must be strong. So, there's that question. And then one more idea that I want to offer is from Yitz Greenberg. Yitz Greenberg.
Yitz Greenberg
is an Orthodox scholar who says that, and this one I find particularly fascinating, because we had a deal with God. We had a covenantal relationship that we would fulfill the mitzvot. And when we fulfill the mitzvot, God will make us like the stars in the sky, like the sands at the beach, that God would make us numerous and protect us. The Holocaust, he says, was God breaking God's part of the covenant. There's no more protection. God, you screwed up. And so he says that all the mitzvot, you know how when you're Orthodox often, that and conservative too, that the whole legal tradition is binding. You have to do it. He says that became broken, and at that point, the legal tradition became voluntary. That God let loose of God's end of the bargain with this destruction of the Jewish people. And so we no longer have to serve God, but you can.
He's Orthodox?
Yes, he is.
But this is against Orthodox dogma, right?
Well, ultimately you still live an Orthodox lifestyle, but yes, this is how he reacted.
If I may just interject, if I may respectfully say, just to defend the conservative side, conservative Judaism just believes that the halakha, the oral law, can be changed, but that the written law cannot be changed.
Well, yes.
From the Chumash.
Yes, but I never contradicted that.
Well, I thought you said that the conservative and Orthodox believe that it can't be changed.
No.
I thought that
I didn't say that. They're both halakhic systems that have to abide by the law. The law can be changed in all movements, just Orthodoxy moves much more slowly.
Okay.
And sometimes in the wrong direction.
But even in Reform Judaism, if the board of rabbis make a law,
but we're not obligated to halakha. Halakha is a factor, but you'll have to come to my course on
I'm sorry. Okay, gotcha.
But then the last thing is, it's the idea that we see in process theology, which is where did God fit into all of this? Some people say that God does not have power over all of evil. God is the most powerful God, but God is limited. And so
you have to believe in God to believe whether he has power, whether there's power or not power.
Yes.
And I'm guessing there are many, many people who do not believe in God.
And if they did believe in God, they stopped believing in God this time.
Yes.
So, which takes us going through the different reactions in terms of Judaism, in terms of religiosity. What you see now in remembering the Holocaust is many different elements of these. We see the drive to remember what's happened, the never forget slogan, which is vitally important to remember every detail, to continually study it, and to have memorials in different places.
I once asked a Holocaust survivor how they felt going through the Holocaust, and I guess it's not good, and says they didn't want to live, but they said that they would describe it as you wanted to die every second of the day.
Yes.
But now another Holocaust survivor's grandson told me that he just really wanted to live and survive. Now they both survived,
right.
But one wanted to die and one wanted to survive.
Right.
So.
But there's the element now of how we remember it today.
Right.
And how we remember it today.
And there's also the element of the individual. The individual who gets cancer, who fights like hell through agony, and the one who gives up because they don't want to go through the agony, the fight. That's just human nature, the difference between people.
Exactly, but we're in the generation now where they're very...
I go to the choir.
Here, I'll finish up. Can you wait 4 minutes?
I can wait for. I don't want to catch your Jackie.
Ask Carol Sue why didn't she come?
No, that's why. No, she's sick today. But that's why we ended 7:20.
Right.
So that gives 10 minutes to get to choir. So we end up. So we have to remember. We have to tell stories. And so the survivors, people like Hank, tell their stories. But we've had the added challenge of figuring out how to preserve these stories because there are very few survivors who are left. And so we've published them. We've put up movies to educate, but we also have days of commemoration. We have Holocaust Remembrance Day, where in this packet I have a ceremony from Mishkan Tefillah, from the Reform Prayer Book, that has readings of his poetry, trying to bring us into that mindset. Also his Kaddish and prayers for the dead to remember the victims. And also has dicta to ourselves to make sure, and this is the other side of this, to make sure that it never happens again.
But even in all the public schools, it's a whole program.
Exactly.
For all children to learn, and they started around 6th or 7th grade. It's not saved for the high school. It started early.
But I also think you have to expose them. The most powerful thing when the kids heard Rochelle and
of course.
It was amazing.
Of course.
I took Nicholas to the Holocaust Museum the weekend before his bar mitzvah because I thought we needed a trip. I never anticipated it.
It's very powerful.
Shaping who he is. We saw a display of all the yarmulkes and the talit that they collected from people on their way into the camps. And he was so...
It's horrifying.
It changed who he was, and that's...
It's what it is to be Jewish, and just as a closing statement. Part of what it is to be Jewish is to remember the Holocaust, but it's important that not everything we're doing is because of Fakenheim's 614th commandment. That being said, one of my colleagues whose husband converted to Judaism, he said he always got the religious aspect of it, of Judaism, but he never understood people, of what it means to be the Jewish part of a people, until he went to a Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem, until he went to Yad Vashem, and he saw what the people went through regardless of whether you believed or you didn't, regardless of whatever attitude you took. And so,
and regardless of whether you were even an eighth Jewish, even if you had an uncle on your mother's side that was Jewish, you were Jewish.
Exactly.
Well, I'm not sure if that's completely correct, if I may respectfully say, meaning there was a lineage that they followed. So if your mother's husband married a Jew, that didn't make you Jewish. It was really a direct line.
Well, it was a blood. I mean, it's a blood connection. But if one of your blood relatives, even an uncle or a great uncle, was Jewish, you were Jewish.
It was. I mean, it really, technically speaking, it had to be a grandparent. The question was,
it was
whether technicality would sit in the
a vertical lineage that decided if you were Jewish or not.
Right. But just to finish this up, I get in terms of the what's a Jew to do class, the knowledge of Yom HaShoah and that we do something to commemorate it, that everyone does something to commemorate it, I think is very important for us to note, because it is part of the Jewish experience to have that kind of collective pain, to have that collective memory, to be part of that. Our challenge is to continue teaching the next generation this is part of the Jewish experience. But also to make sure that it is not the whole Jewish experience.
Of course not.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There should be a lot of interesting reading in here.
I'm just curious. I remember you reminded me to say that it was nice of you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
If I decide to go, because I have some other engagements. When do I have to give you advance notice?
I need to know by tomorrow.
Oh, you really need to know by tomorrow? Okay, gotcha.
The RSVP was due today.
Oops. Okay, gotcha. Thanks. It's that short, right?
Some accountability.
Yeah.
For community theater, you mean?
Yes. Are you coming? Wait, sorry, you have to what?
Turn in all my RSVPs.
Yes. They were due today. But we have a record attendance. We have right now 56 people signed up. Yeah.
Well, if I change it to Staten Island, I'll put it to the center.
Thank you.
Hopefully
Sure.
I'll get to Staten Island. That's
And I
once
didn't
a
mean
year
to
I
shut
get
you
to see
down.
my
No, Rabbi.
Right.
Yeah.
Because there are so many. The Holocaust can't be taught in a semester.
No, I know.
Course,
That was one point I really wanted to give, because to me it's an important point to make, that Muslims were involved in that. They make it sound like Jews lived on a Bahamas cruise in Muslim countries, when just relatively speaking to the Holocaust, it wasn't as bad. And that's,
Absolutely.
I'm telling you, the groundhog needs different accountability.
Sergio, do you want one of these?
Yes.
You can have two if you want.
No, I'll take that.
This is a great collection of readings, actually. It's a book called The Jew in the Modern World. That has primary documents from all through modern Jewish history.
Okay, so
How much
I
would
would,
I for the
if you could,
coffee?
do they have any tutoring needs that you know of now? Or?
Certainly not. I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, well, I do kids of all grades. Some of my kids are A- kids, they want them to be A kids. And
Because the Jews went through this, how do they try to prevent what's going on in
how old is the youngest?
We have a lot of
Oh, very nice. So he'll be taking the New Jersey ASK exam
a lot of
soon.
yeah.
When he's in third grade.
We've had
I will
demonstrations.
definitely keep it in
Some
mind.
people
Thank you.
simply don't.
Because they may need
But
it.
there are a lot of political demonstrations and petitions
back, that's what happened back in 38 and 39.
and some people have sponsored
Especially
You were born Jewish.
an incredible organization.
Where you from?
Everyone in the belt.
Where you from? Where'd you
The
grow up?
American Jewish World
Oh, where did I
Service. What they
grow
do
up?
is
I
they
grew up
support
in
local
Harlem.
NGOs.
Okay.
But I mean, it's a good
Then I got married and I raised my children.
question.
In Jersey.
Well, you know, the UN still doesn't want to call
I'm
it
one of the
genocide
original.
per se. The UN is calling it
UN and
They're trying to be.
You might know some people that I know.
you
Oh, I don't know. I know more than
whoever
the temper
is there to
I know
manage the
people that
situation.
never-
Whereas I know they have to tread, lightly.
Do you know Ruth Weinfeld?
But it just seems, as the rest of the world is not doing anything about it. And then 20 years
You
ago,
know,
they'll say, oh, well, no one does anything about it.
Jeffrey and Sharon Lotta.
What's going on. It was a very interesting book.
So he died.
And it
But
just feels like
I'm trying to think what I know. Chinnett's family. I know more people from that van, not so much from that van.
Did you know
Argentina.
No, George Ford.
Yeah, that's why there's this
You know, I know a guy named Bruce Ford in Highland Park.
They're so tied to.
Oh,
German.
so George is from, where's George? He's from,
But,
oh, and he went to Emanu in Edison?
No, he was in He changed and he
I must
changed.
get going.
Yeah, my wife.
Woodbridge. I know Rabbi Cool.
I just went out there. The wind was separating us.
Thank you.
I think if it had been like this all along, you kind of go,
Oh, wow.
okay, and then when it was over, it was over. But now, it's like, here, no.
That's your,
So be it, right? Yeah.
I said that's your loss, you know.
Right, right.
I mean, he stayed with me, but he couldn't walk
that's not
into
even that hard because it's going to turn to.
Is that your umbrella, Rabbi?
It's going to start to rain, but
Yeah,
I still
I mean,
think
you
you
know,
may
for
see it
example,
because
I think
it's
it's
going to be so
Car-
icy that
what's
you may not
Carol
want to
Sue?
get out.
She was saying that she feels that this reform setup is a little bit to the right for reform, which is what she likes because she grew up Orthodox. But she became reform mostly for the egalitarianism.
I grew up Orthodox.
Right.
We're to the right when it comes to ritual.
Okay, yeah.
When it comes to our politics and our
Oh, that's what I meant. I'm
we're
not talking
left.
about politics.
We're very
Yeah, I'm talking about religion, of course.
Left, I mean, yes,
I know
but we
it's
also
big.
have, I'd say our congregation's about 20% Republican.
Oh, that's good, that's good, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
So I think what I think is I don't like isolating our congregation to the left or the right. We're pluralistic.
And that's what's good about it.
We have a lot of different perspectives in our community. We have people who grew up classical reform, and we've got an Orthodox rabbi who's a member of our community.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Miguel Bash.
Okay.
He's incredible. And so
And there's
really you
freedom
can't
to be whoever you want to be.
you can't classify our community. We've got people from all backgrounds, and it's just wonderful.
Well, Neve has Orthodox.
Yeah, of course, obviously, yeah.
A few reform that went to Neve.
I must go pick up my wife.
Bye, Rabbi.
Yes,
She doesn't
please,
get stuck up.
Good to see you, thank you.
Thanks for coming today.
Yeah.
Good to see you. Next
See
week
you
will be
Wednesday.
more uplifting.
See you Wednesday.
Not next week, because next week's
Yeah, so
Pesach.
he's like
By the way,
Okay.
we don't have class for 2 weeks
Okay. It's beautiful.
because it's Passover.
2
So
weeks from now, oh yeah.
But will we have class on Wednesday and the following Wednesday?
the following Wednesday, no, during Pesach, all adult education, I believe, is canceled.
Okay.
Yes, but after that we have class.
So we can-
Yeah,
So we'll see you
it's
then
good
in
to
2
see.
weeks.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Rabbi. When was this? I'm sorry.
We were 3 weeks.
So, I
Happy,
go to lunch
do you
tomorrow
celebrate
on
Easter?
Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
So
This
that's
is my
very
parents'
interesting.
holiday,
Well,
so I
I'm
recognize
retired,
it
so.
And your
Well,
kids
enjoy
are
your
nice.
time.
Exactly.
Well,
You
took me 77 years to
You
get
ring
here.
the sabers.
Do it by yourself, or?
We'll see you.
The
Everybody.
kids are
And by
looking for
yourself, or by
chocolate.
yourself?
This is what Easter is.
Where'd you retire from?
Driving a DACA school bus.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's why I don't think anything going out in this weather.
Oh, you're used to driving, huh?
I drove it with a school bus.
Yeah, and they
I'm
kinda
sure-
let
was
you
a
go
school
with
bus?
what you want
A big
too,
one.
so.
The biggest they make.
Not school bus, though.
School bus.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you were not somebody that would drop a kid off at the wrong place. When I was
No.
in kindergarten,